Anyways, on June 1st, we went out to the streets. We asked people what's their opinion on renting versus owning. We're fortunate enough to get about 41 different perceptions. Later on, we sat down, we looked at each perception, and so if it's true. Typically, these perceptions are formed from news, could be from family or friends, it could be from social media. But we just wanted to fact check them just to see if it's actually true. The very first perception we're going to explore today is going to be if a residential property investment is a long-term viable option. So we will start off with some stats, then we will dive into a case study, and then finally we will look at some stats again, and also we'll share our perspectives. My name is Spencer, I'm a mortgage agent based out of London, Ontario. We've got Diana. Go ahead.
I'm Diana Taylor from Royal LePage Triland, realtor here in London, Ontario.
And Chris.
My name is Chris Lee. I'm the owner of Park Road Furniture, and happy to be here today.
Perfect. So diving right into stats. So let's start with mortgage interest rate stats, because that's typically a hot topic. People would like to discuss it. People are curious about when it's going to go down, when it's going to go up. So what it says here, based on CREA's report, average mortgage interest rate for the last 25 years, that's from 1999 to 2024, was around 4.55%. Now at this time, I was barely born and I was in India, so I wouldn't know if these rates are correct. So I'm just gonna, ask Chris and Diana here. Does that sound factual? Does that sound like closer to what it was, based on your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I looked up these rates as well, and when you average it all out, it does come out to this, because the number kind of shocked me at first, and I thought, oh, that seems a little low, but it has been quite low over the last 24 years, so.
And it's interesting because you hear about these stories of in the 80s when the interest rates were closer to 20%, and that's really scary to think about. But on average, it's interesting to see that average over 25 years is as low as it is at 4.5.
So that's the rate, around 4.5.
Yeah.
And today we're not that far off.
No.
It's true.
Okay. Average property value growth rate was around 6.08% year over year. Now I know there are some years there's been, it's been not the case. It's been wild. It may be like 10%, and there were years in the past where there was barely any increase in property purchase price. Recently, last 2 years, or
Yes.
zero, right? Or it
Yes.
may have gone down a little bit for some properties at least,
Yeah.
right? But 6.08, does that number look reasonable to you?
I think that would make sense, especially since we're including, with the massive increases that we had over the last few years. I think that when you average it all out, you're going to get down to that 6.08.
Got it. Now, the average rent for detached property, it says $1,560. Now, just to put that into perspective, it was not $1,560 in 1999, and it's not $1,560 today. $1,560 is the average for the last 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we've got the average maintenance cost of a detached property, which is $4,510. That equates to around $350 a month. Now, keep in mind, you do have to replace your roof maybe every 15 years, but you don't have to do that every year. Right?
So on average, it comes down.
Exactly, right? And some months you're not even going to spend $350 on maintaining your house, right? Now, this is not property tax. This is strictly maintenance cost. This is just fixing your plumbing. This could be, taking care of the needs. Again, this is not upgrades either, right? This is not renovating your basement.
Absolute maintenance.
Exactly. Now, average property tax for detached home in London, Ontario, last 25 years, around $3,504. Now, property tax is strictly based on the property price and the city rules and all that. So again, this is also an average, not necessarily. We cannot pinpoint exact, right? Because it's also a range. There are apartments with a couple thousand, maybe like $2,000 for property tax, versus there are big detached homes with closer to $8,000 or $9,000 for property tax. So this is again an average. Now you got inflation adjusted value of $10,000 from 1999 to 2024, around $16,406. The reason we did this metrics is in 1999, let's say if you wanted to buy a $150,000 house, you wanted around $7,500, which is a 5% down, and let's say another 1.5% for closing cost. So that's going to be around $2,250. So total $9,750. So you needed about $10,000 to buy a $150,000 property, minimum, right? So this $10,000 would be around $16,400 today. So one of the things I noticed when I saw that number is the fact that now $16,406, it's not real. I mean, if you look at today, that's not the huge amount for you to save up to, right? But at the same time, with $10,000, you could potentially buy a detached home in 1999. With $16,000, you could barely get into a 1+1 bedroom condo. So the difference is with $10,000, you can have shelter. You can own the shelter for your, let's say, a small family with 2 kids. But today, you cannot own a shelter with 2 kids for $16,000, right?
Correct.
You can fit, let's say, a single working professional. It can fit maybe a couple who doesn't have kids yet, but it's not ideal for family. Does that make sense?
I agree, yeah.
Yeah.
Totally.
Now, find the investment value of $10,000 in Canadian market, 1999 to 2024, $48,000. So let's say if you did not invest this $10,000, let's say you didn't put this down for your property. Instead, you put that $10,000 into Canadian market as a whole, whether that's Toronto Stock Exchange or S&P 500. If you did put that $10,000 and you didn't touch it for the last 25 years, today you will have around $48,277. So these stats, you will see why it's relevant as we jump into the case study later on. So the case study based on these stats was, let's assume it's 1999 today. And you did have that $10,000. Your family income is about $40,000. $40,000 in 1999. What do you guys think? A family of, if you guys have decent jobs, is
That would be a good job.
$40,000?
Yeah.
For a family, you think?
Yeah.
Husband and wife?
Two
Yeah.
incomes?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so too. Yeah. I think that's pretty accurate.
So $40,000. How would you, I mean, I didn't do the math here, but like a $40,000 job in 1999, what does that equate to today? Like roughly, what would you say? Or what kind of jobs would earn that kind of money in 1999?
Good question. Now you're making us go back in
Yeah.
time.
I would think somebody maybe in healthcare,
Yeah?
Yeah.
and maybe another working professional or,
A factory job?
yeah, that's a good example. I
Yeah?
think, yeah.
You'd make about 20 grand? So this is like
I think
family,
so.
that's husband and wife, right,
Yeah.
together.
Yeah.
Individually about 20,000.
Yep.
So if you work in a factory, you could potentially make around 20 grand in 1999.
I would think that's probably
Possible.
fairly accurate.
Yeah.
Possible,
That
yeah?
would make sense.
So, okay, that's fair. Now the property purchase price, let's say it's a $150,000 property.
Yep.
Down payment for a $150,000 property, let's say you're putting minimum down, which is 5%, is going to be $7,500. And like we said before, the closing cost is going to be around $2,250. Now, based on this and assuming the average interest rate was 4.55, based on the stats, your monthly mortgage payment is going to be around $825 a month. Did either one of you own a property around that time?
I did.
You did?
No.
What was do you recall your monthly mortgage payment?
I do not, but it was higher than 4.5 at that time.
Yeah.
I would say in 1999, you said, right?
Correct.
Yeah, in 1999, well, I would really be guessing, but I'm going to say it probably was closer to 6-7%.
Got it.
Yeah.
What was your monthly payment like?
Oh.
Was it under 1,000? Over 1,000?
Oh, it would have been, I would say, it was under 1,000. Or, I'm really guessing.
Yeah, under 1,000?
It'd be close to 1,000 anyways.
Was the property purchase price around 150 or was it a little bit more?
We were, at that time, we purchased our property, I believe, at around 120.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
And it was under 1,000.
close to it
Do you
anyways.
still have this property?
No.
Okay. Do you wish you had this property?
Well, yes, of course. I'd like to sell it today.
Totally.
The average maintenance cost for last 25 years, $376, like we discussed before. Property tax around $292 a month. Again, $292 is probably a little too high in 1999. So this is not what it was 1999 or 2024. This was the average. Average rent during this period was around $1,560. Now, average property value growth, like we said before, was 6.08%. An average market return, when we say market return, that's strictly, let's say if you were to invest the money in Toronto Stock Exchange or S&P 500, something of that sort, over the course of last 25 years, if you were to look at the whole return and divide that by 25 years, we're going to land at 6.5. Does that make sense? Now, here is where we're going to look at the case study. So this is the base assumptions we're making, right? The reason we're looking back at 25 years is to answer a question like, is housing a long-term investment or owning a property a long-term investment? There's no way for us to predict the future, right? God knows what's going to happen. 10 years down the road, if someone start traveling to Mars, right? Properties in the world might become less valuable. I mean, I know it's a bit dramatic, but it's a possibility, right?
Who knows?
So the only way for us to kind of sort of fact check this is to look back last 25 years. There's no way to kind of look forward to 25 years and make predictions. Is that fair?
Yep, definitely.
So let's say the first person A, they went ahead with the numbers they have and they decided to invest in a property. Now this property is this person's primary residence, right? So it's a family of 2 kids, husband and wife. They decide to buy a property. The initial investment, totaling the down payment and the closing cost, was around $9,750. Total cost of owning for 25 years, that number, $447,900, or putting it up, $448,000, includes the monthly property tax, monthly maintenance cost, and the mortgage payment. So all combined, times 12, times 25 years, is that number, $448,000. So it's the cumulative cost of owning a property in the last 25 years. Now the property value in 2024, if the property grew 6.08% year over year, it's going to be worth around $656,000. So the net growth will be the difference between the money you invested, which is $9,750, and $656,000. It's going to be around $646,000. So if you now look at the percentage relative to the initial investment, the percentage growth is around 6,628%. Or in other words, your initial investment of $9,750 grew 66 times over the course of 25 years.
Yeah, seems dramatic, yeah.
Yeah.
Seems dramatic,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Now, I personally, like everyone, I bought my property recently in East End of London. Every single one of my neighbors got into their property before 2000s. So the property I paid $500,000 for in 2022, most of these guys have paid less than $100,000. So I know it's dramatic, but at the same time, I feel like, these numbers, one of the things when I came across these numbers from, doing my research and all that, I was like, wow, it is super dramatic, but at the same time, this is very true in a handful of people that I know personally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did you guys, when you guys got the report and went through it, did you guys have the same feeling when you saw that? Or what was your feeling when you first saw 66 times?
Yeah, I thought it was a huge number. You don't really factor it all in when you think about owning a house. Sometimes you feel like it's a good investment, but you don't realize the effect that it's going to have over that period of time. So to see it on paper is pretty impressive.
Wow. What about you, Dan?
Well, first thing I did was math. I'm going to fact check that.
Is this right?
Yeah. So Diana was fact checking my percentage.
Yeah.
But you're right. Like when you go into owning a home, I think we look at the expenses a lot more than if you're renting a home, right? Because when you're renting, you just assume everything's going to be looked after by the landlord. But when you're owning a home, you know that if a big ticket item comes up, for example, the furnace and AC, that's going to become your expense, and you just see the bulk of it as opposed to over time, how it all works out to come to this eventual growth of 66%. It's hard to see that when you're in the moment.
And I think sometimes you think when those big ticket items come up, oh, as a homeowner, I can't really afford that, but somehow you do.
Yes.
And you're thankful that you do. In the end, you're like,
Yeah.
this was well worth that investment in a new furnace, because now not only am I more comfortable, the house is feeling nicer, but in the end, that's going to appreciate my house value as well.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So I know potentially a lot of people watching this is going, yeah, but you also spent $448,000 in the house, right? Now we're going to answer that question later on, right? Because if we, right now we're saying 66 times based on just the initial investment, but there is cost of having this house, which is the mortgage, the property tax, and the maintenance. So why are we not factoring it in? We'll answer that question in a bit. So renting and investing. Now let's say person B, this person decide, again, the same family, husband and wife, 2 kids, but they decide we're not going to own, instead we're going to we're going to rent and invest the difference into, let's say, the market. So the initial investment is going to be exactly the same. They save that $10,000 because at this time they don't have to put that down. Instead, they can keep it to themselves. So they invested that initial $10,000 right away. Total cost of renting, though, for the last 25 years is actually more than owning, $468,000. Now, how does that make sense? Well, if we look at the breakdown, in 1999, when you start off a mortgage with all the property tax and maintenance costs, it would be around $1,400. Now, cost of renting at this time was actually relatively cheaper. It was around $1,200. But here's the deal: 5 years later, now your cost of renting has risen to $1,400. Now you're break even. The cost of owning versus renting is exactly the same. But then 5 years after that, now your cost of renting goes up, cost of owning still stays the same. So for the first 10 years, if you're renting, you do have a difference that can be invested. But for the next 15 years, you have no difference that can be invested. As a matter of fact, for the next 15 years, for every dollar you invest in terms of difference, you're losing 20 cents. Because your cost of owning becomes relatively cheaper to renting after the first 10 years. So it was around $468,000. Again, this is an average, right? Based on last 25 years.
Right.
If we look at numbers strictly from 1999, this number is going to be much cheaper on the renting side. If you look at strictly the numbers in 2024, this number is going to be very dramatic on the renting side. But we wanted to have relatively a reasonable perspective, right? Not something which is drastically leaning to one side or the other side. So investment value for that $10,000, which means you're not making any additional investment. The only investment you have is that initial $10,000. Now that grows to $48,000. But when you do a net growth calculation, you have to take away the $10,000, the initial investment, from this $48,000. So that becomes $38,000. And if you look at the difference between owning and renting, there's another $20,000. So if you subtract both, the actual net growth of the second decision is $18,177. So your $10,000 grew $18,177. So that's 1.81 times your return over 25 years.
Not a good return on your investment.
Yeah, it beat the inflation, right?
Yes.
That's about it.
It's safe.
It's
safe.
safe. Yeah, it's extremely safe.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way. So now let's answer, why did we not factor in the cost of owning in the owning example? Why did not we factor in that $447,000? Instead, we said your initial investment grew 66 times. Here's the reason. 2 things. Owning a property leads to significantly higher net growth investment compared to renting and investing in the difference. Net growth difference 64.47 times. The reason we say that is because either you own or rent, you have to have a shelter.
Yes.
Right? So if you look at scenario number 2, you were not owning at this time, but you paid $468,000 for shelter. When you own, you pay $20,000 less, but more than that, you're having that expense stagnant there, which means either or you're going to spend that money. Technically, you're becoming a passive investor. And it's for that reason we did not factor that in. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
What do you guys think about that? Because for me, when I that's when that fog cleared up. That's when my perceptions kind of like took a back seat, and I realized, oh, this is why this is a long-term investment. It's because shelter is a basic need. You have to spend for it no matter what. And if you spend for it while owning a property, you're going to make 66 times your money. Because keep in mind, when you rent and pay $468,000, that's gone.
Right.
You don't see that money ever again.
I think that was my mentality when I first purchased my first house, was that I'm throwing all this money away on rent, and nobody's except for my landlord is making anything on it. And so my thought was I have to find something to buy. And for me, it was just a matter of finding anything that worked at that point. And I actually started in Old East as well. And, at that point, you find something reasonable that works for yourself, and you just get in, because at that point, you're doing yourself a favor by starting at least somewhere, earning some equity, putting that money to good use versus just handing it to somebody else. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Diana.
Well, as a realtor, I have to concur with you 100%.
I suppose you would.
But even before that, when I first decided to set up house way back, we won't talk about the year, there was 3 of us getting married on the same day, which was interesting, and we were all talking about what we were going to do, rent versus owning, and we didn't obviously do numbers like this, but that was certainly my mentality too, is like, why would you rent? Because you're just giving it away. However, on the other side of it, when you own, people tend to maybe spend a little bit more money because they want to make it their own. But I also hear from renters who do the same thing. They also do renovations, like minor renovations, but maybe putting up a fence or adding a dishwasher because they're not happy with what the landlord has provided. So there's still some expenses that they're putting into their rental, not to the same extent, but in the end, when you're adding it to your own property, you're adding value. So your investment continues to increase in value.
Absolutely. I think your pride factor goes up in that ownership as well. The minute you have that, you're thinking, what can I do to make it my own? And
yes,
what are people going to think when I make all these new improvements to it? And it's going to look great when I'm done, and I'm going to be so proud of it. I think that plays a big factor too.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, sorry, Dana.
Well, I was just going to say too, and when you get to the end, at the other end, and I think we saw this when we were walking around the park talking to some of the seniors, is what if you're in a situation where maybe life was a little tough and you weren't able to put away a ton of money, because that's just the way the cards were dealt to you. But now you have this property that you can sell, and you've got a major investment of money. There's money now that you can draw on for your remaining time. Whereas if you're renting, you still have nothing left to draw from.
And you still have to pay somebody that rent.
Yeah.
There was actually someone who's sitting, we interviewed. He's after, I think, well past his retirement. He said he made 8 times the money he invested into the property, which right now he says, and right now he's renting, and he says I have more than enough cash. Because I have my retirement, plus I have all this money sitting aside, which I got from selling my property.
Yeah, and they don't always even have to sell to get their hands on some of that money, right? There are other vehicles they can use to withdraw some of that money if maybe moving isn't the right option at the moment. So you have options to diversify and still have your shelter.
And if it's paid off.
Yeah.
Right?
That's the key.
Yeah, if it's paid off.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the way we've designed this example, right? 25 years paid off. We did not factor in the fact they may have refinanced and all that things, because we were just looking at the base scenario, what happens, right? Now, a simple comparison between those two numbers, just to summarize the whole thing. Initial investment for buying a property was $9,750. Renting, you're actually not investing the 10 grand, instead you're investing that $10,000 right away. So the initial investment was $10,000. Total living cost was $447,900. based on the average numbers for owning a property, versus it was 468,000, so it was around 20 grand more for renting. Final value in 2024 was $656,038 for owning, $48,277 in renting. And this $48,277 is not the money the landlord gave back. It's actually your investment grew to $48,000, right? And net growth, when you deduct the initial investment from the final value, for owning it was $646,288 versus renting was $18,177. So the growth multiple when you own a property is 66 times your initial investment versus you rent 1.81 times. So the net growth difference between owning and renting in favor of owning is 64 times.
Significant.
Yeah, it's significantly different.
Significantly different, yeah.
So now, just to tie it all in, let's do some statistical observation for the last 20 years. Over 20 years, prices have risen 225 times. That means from 163,000 to 531,000, according to Canadian Real Estate Association, CREA. Now, these numbers are average, corner to corner in the whole country. In cities, prices have risen 258 times, so it's better than overall Canada. Cities have seen slightly more growth. That is from 243,000 to 870,000. So this is average price of a home, right, in Canada. Now the housing market is subject to cycles of boom and bust, but has recovered relatively quickly in Canada compared to other countries. That's a very valid point. So what it's saying is housing market doesn't stay the same. It doesn't grow consistently. It doesn't go down consistently. Instead, it has more like, up and down, right? That's the path it takes. However, in Canada, that's not that dramatic. That's not that drastic. It's typically very, very much not a lot of bump and downs. Is that something you can relate to? Because you guys were around in 2008. That was one of the times where everything just went down.
Bust. Yeah. I was just in real estate at that time. 2007 was actually when I became a realtor, and it was a great year. And it was like somebody shut a door in 2008 on the real estate market on that grim September morning. I still remember it. But London is a little bit more conservative. So, if you're going to compare it to some of the other cities, we actually see London moving even less than the ups and downs that we've seen in other cities. We did see people losing jobs because we had transition of factories moving, closing down, especially if they're American owned, right? So people did lose their houses at that time, but prices, I would say, didn't significantly drop during that time.
In Canada?
In our area, they didn't significantly drop. However, it did take a little bit of time for it to come back up again. So I would say in London, the area growth was probably closer to 1% at that time. But then by the time we hit 2016, we started to see it increase quite a bit more until we came to April of 2022, where we had a significant increase by that point.
So Chris, let me ask you this. So what Diana is saying is in 2008, the market grew 1%. Now we're comparing this to
I wouldn't say it grew in 2008. It actually may have gone down that little bit.
So may have gone down, let's say 2% or 3%, maybe, right?
Max.
Now we're talking in states, people were leaving home. They were just like abandoning their house and going. Mm-hmm. Let the bank take this over. Like that, I find that a wild contrast. That's what was happening in states, our neighboring country, versus here, maybe the prices dropped 2 to 3%. Why is that the case in Canada? Why do you think Canada is stable that way?
I think it has to do with the rules in the banking department.
You think so?
Absolutely.
So we have a stronger economy.
Yes.
I heard the rules were very different in Canada as opposed to they were offering very weird mortgages in the U.S.
Yeah,
is that right?
Almost anybody could get a mortgage, no matter what.
Subprime kind of.
Yeah. Whereas we've always had some rules in place, which sometimes people don't like, but it does make sense when you run into a crunch like that. It means that you may not lose your home or have to walk away from it.
Do you think we still have that resilience as a country?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you believe
I
so?
think we have more resilience.
Than what it was before.
I think that there's always lessons learned when you go through a cycle like that, and I think that they try to put things in place. Sometimes it's a little late when things come in, but I think we have enough to keep us grounded.
Yeah, I agree. I think the rules have only increased for Canadians. I think the rules are very mostly clear to people now, and I think they're putting hard lines on what people can and can't buy, and really outlining. People are mortgage agents, real estate agents are really informing their clients on that kind of thing. And so I think that it's in general it's been pretty stringent and understood.
So all those people who are waiting for the gloom and doom, the market to crash so they can buy the property, do you have any advice for them?
Well,
in general?
Keep waiting.
yeah, I mean, you have population can be divided into many different groups, right?
Right.
So if you stay in the average group, you're going to do well. Just put it that way.
Okay, and what is the average?
I think you just keep moving forward, do what makes sense for you, as opposed to waiting. I think waiting, I mean, based on these numbers here, clearly waiting just means that your value proposition decreases if you wait. Right?
Yeah.
So if you get in now, yes, maybe you have to ride a few bumps before you see the return. But at the end of 25 years, clearly from historical perspective, we're seeing that there's great value in that.
But the interesting question then is the next 25 years going to be similar to what we have experienced in the past?
No crystal ball, sorry. But
Yeah, like you said earlier, it's hard to predict that.
It's hard to predict, right?
Yeah.
Because especially because of everything that happened last 10 years,
Yep.
technology-wise,
yeah, who knows?
right?
But like you said also, we still have to have shelter.
We have to have shelter, but like the only variable which kind of like in my head that's not so clear is the fact that, you know, sometimes these innovations, you don't see it coming. Like probably the one you can relate to is internet came around, but to have visualized what it is today, none of us could possibly do that in 2000, right? Electric cars. Look at anything. We have rockets that goes up in outer space and comes back and land. So these kind of things, there's no way we could visualize it unless you're the inventor yourself. You cannot visualize it. You cannot just comprehend it until you see it happening. Right? It's like that Bible story where he says, "Have to touch your, to believe your back." It's the same thing, and that's where I have like a bit of open. I'm a bit open there, if that's open to that possibility of something revolutionizing housing as a whole, right? But then when you emotionally think, if I have a family, husband, with a wife and 2 kids, I will need a place to stay. Can it be revolutionized to something that I haven't seen yet? Possibly.
Possibly, yeah. Who knows?
So that's about it for the whole stats. Now, if you guys want to summarize, how was your experience? I know, Chris, you got involved after the street videos, but if you were to summarize your whole experience, did you learn something new? If so, what it was, and what's your perspective now about all of it?
I'm pro-buy. I think for a long time I have been. I think this just strengthened my interest in that, or the knowledge that I had in it. It helps me see that it makes sense, and for me, it definitely made sense when I got into my first house. I think that was a really good investment. That was 2009, so 15 years, I guess. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Is that 15 years or so I've owned a house, one or another, and I've always seen it as far superior to renting, just in the sense that it's mine. I can do whatever I want with it. I know that it's making me money. I know that if something big comes up, I have some equity in the house that I can pull out, big renovation or something that I want to do. So I have that ability, and yeah, I just think that this this case study that you've brought kind of sheds some light on that. So I thought it's been really interesting.
What about you, Diana?
Well, one thing that you said is pulling out equity there out of your house. I guess that the one thing that I always talk to my clients about too is that when you're buying a house, buy smart. And so I wonder sometimes when I hear comments today, because we all know what happened in 21 and 22 when people were grabbing onto anybody who would give them another dollar so they could get a house, because we had to find them a house and they're maybe spending more than they should. So I think my advice there would be is to always buy wisely. Don't spend all your dollars. Save money for a rainy day as well. It's just like when you're looking for rent, you're not going to go and look for the most expensive place. You're going to try to find the cheapest place you can that covers your needs. You should do the same with housing, I think, is you should look for that house that's going to fill your needs, but not the most expensive house. Because then what are you going to do if that furnace breaks down? Are you going to be in trouble? What about if your car breaks down? Like, it's not just always house expenses that can be problematic in your money situation. And so, when we walked around on that day to just chat with people, it was really interesting to hear all of those different perspectives because I'm used to teaching about what's good in the to buy real estate, and then all of a sudden I'm hearing some people saying, well, we're in real estate and I think we want to get out and go rent. That just was like, oh, you do? Of course, it wasn't the moment to chat with them about that, but I was just like, oh, okay, that was interesting. I hadn't really met that before. So putting this all together on paper makes it really clear that what we believe, there's value there, as long as you do it right, because there's always the right way and wrong way to do things.
So just to summarize what Chris said, it's basically you do see a lot of potential for owning a home. It could be leveraging it down the road, right?
Yep.
It could be tons of things like that. So you are pro-buy in that regard.
And I'd like to point out one more thing if I could.
Sure.
I think a lot of people these days think they can't afford a house, and we talked earlier about when you do buy a first house and doing what I like to call house hacking and renting part of the house out to somebody else. I think that's a really quality way of supplementing that income. Like, so you can actually get into your house and you own it, but you have somebody supplementing that income and helping you pay down that mortgage, or maybe it's a duplex or something like that where it's completely self-contained on the other side. If you can get into one of those, I think that's really what people these days should be looking at.
Cool. So one is definitely you see a lot of merits of owning a home. Number two is the fact that to get into a home, you could be a bit creative as well.
For sure.
You could potentially look into renting part of the house, things like that. And from Diana, whatever you said, you know, to add to that point, when you try to buy a home, just have the same render's mindset as opposed to, okay, what do I need as a shelter? Like, what are my basic needs that this property has to meet? And go off of that instead of seeing how much, what's the maximum amount I can qualify for, and let me get the best house. Maybe not the first one. You could potentially get there.
Yeah.
But for the first one, you should be more looking at it from a lens of a renter. Likewise, just what's the best house that I can find that would meet my needs, and that's all I need for now.
Yes.
Get in the game.
Yeah,
right?
Get in the game.
For me, if I were to summarize like my whole experience with going out to the street and doing the case study afterwards, you meet a variety of people, right? That has different needs. They want different things from their lives. Now, if I were to group these, the whole number of people into two different groups, there are a small set of people who would like the fluidity. They want to be maybe the world travelers. They want to live in London for 2 years. They want to live in like maybe Toronto for 2 years. After that, they would like to move to Australia. Maybe they want to live in New Zealand after that. And if they truly mean that, they're accepting the consequence of renting, right? They probably want that fluidity to move around, which is totally understandable. But for the other group who are most likely not going to do that, they want to stay in a town, they want to raise a beautiful family, and something of that sort. Let's say you want to live 25 years, next 25 years until you retire in London. or any other cities like that. In that regard, if you do have perceptions about owning versus renting, it's very important to do a fact check. Now, if you have seen a bunch of 1-minute videos on social media saying, okay, you can rent and invest the difference, like we have seen, if things don't change much, if nobody comes around and revolutionize housing as a whole, most likely in long term, you're probably going to enjoy the difference for the first 10 years, but after that, like we've seen in the past, you're probably going to look back and wish, well, I wish if I did own a property 10 years ago, right? So in that regard, again, if it's their perspective of living a certain way, that's totally their choice. But if it's the perception that's overclouding their perspective, and the perception, like we said before, coming from traditional media sources, news channels, or let's say friends and family, or even social media in that regard, it's best to do something like this. Sit back and do the numbers. We're gonna have the ChatGPT link posted, so if you want to go through what happened in the back end, they could potentially do it. But also, don't trust us. Go out there, run these numbers for yourself. Go knock on your neighbor's door and ask him this question if you have owned a property for the last 25 years, and break through that perception and have a clear perspective on what you want to do. That's kind of my take.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a wrap?
That's a wrap.
That's a wrap.
Perfect.